Three faces of evil. What if evil didn't hide in the shadows? What if it didn't come with horns, blood-stained axes, or twisted grins like in the movies? What if it looked you in the eye and smiled? Ted Bundy, the charming stranger with a broken arm and a soft voice, who lured women into helping him, only to lead them into forests they'd never walk out of. Andrei Chikatilo, a quiet Soviet clerk who stalked train stations and parks, tearing apart over 50 innocent lives with a blade and deadened eyes. John Wayne Gacy, a beloved community clown who made balloon animals for kids while the stench of corpses filled the crawl space beneath his home. They didn't lurk in the dark. They didn't run from society. They walked among us. 3 men, 3 decades, 3 versions of the same nightmare. Cruel, calculated, cold-blooded. This isn't just about murder. This is about how easily we're fooled by a smile, how evil thrives when it wears the face of someone we trust. So ask yourself, are you ready to see past the masks? Because the worst monsters aren't hiding in the woods. They're standing right beside you. I say Ted Bundy, the gentleman killer. He looked like a law student, an activist, a boyfriend your mother would trust. He had soft eyes, a neat haircut, and a voice that could calm even the most suspicious listener. But Ted Bundy was not what he seemed. He was a predator, dressed in confidence, wrapped in charm, and sharpened by something much darker than intelligence. A hunger for power that only death could satisfy. Bundy's crimes began quietly in 1974, but the seeds had been there for years. They saw vulnerability. He saw opportunity. Once they leaned in, it was over. He had a crowbar hidden. The blow was sudden, jarring, and left them defenseless. He would then drag them to his car, handcuff them, and take them far from where help could reach. The bodies didn't show up right away. At first, there were only names: Linda Healy, Donna Manson, Susan Rancourt, Roberta Parks. Girls who vanished with no trace, swallowed by forests and shadows. In July 1974, broad daylight, Janice Ott and Denise Naslund were taken hours apart from a park near Seattle. Hundreds of witnesses had seen a man with his arm in a sling. He introduced himself. Ted. They helped him and never came back. The police were flooded. Tips poured in. The name Ted kept coming up. A Volkswagen Beetle. A man with a sling. But Bundy slipped through, smiling all the way. He moved to Utah in late 1974 under the guise of law school. But his pattern continued. One night, he crossed paths with Melissa Smith, the 17-year-old daughter of a local police chief. She was smart, responsible, kind. She vanished. Her body was found days later, cast aside in a canyon. The bruises on her face told a story no parent should ever have to imagine. Then came Laura Aim. Same age, same kindness, same fate. Bundy's methods grew colder, more organized. He now kept trophies, Locks of hair, jewelry, makeup, pieces of their lives he could hold on to. In November 1974, he approached Carol Durant at a shopping mall, posing as a police officer. He said her car had been broken into and offered to escort her to the station. She stepped into his Volkswagen. At first, everything seemed routine, but minutes later, she noticed they weren't heading toward the police station. When she questioned him, his tone shifted. He pulled to the side. He grabbed her wrist. She fought with everything she had, kicked, screamed, clawed at the car door. She broke free. Carol Durant survived, and she remembered. Her testimony and description led police to a name they had heard before, Ted. And now they had a sketch, a car description, and someone who got away. Bundy was finally arrested in August 1975. When police searched his car, what they found was chilling. A ski mask, rope, handcuffs, an ice pick. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a mobile hunting kit. He was charged with attempted kidnapping, but still refused to connect himself to any of the missing girls. He went to trial, lost, and went to prison. In 1977, while awaiting trial for murder in Colorado, Bundy made his first escape. He jumped out of a second-story courthouse window during a recess, sprained his ankle, disappeared into the mountains for 6 days. He was caught, but the message was clear. He wasn't done. Back in jail, he planned his next escape, this time using a hacksaw, starvation, and sheer patience. He cut through the ceiling of his cell, crawled through ductwork, and walked out of the building in street clothes. No alarms, no panic. Just another Tuesday. After escaping for the second time in late 1977, Bundy fled to Florida. He had nothing, no money, no ID, no allies, but he still had his darkest weapon, the ability to pretend he was normal. He drifted into Tallahassee, where no one recognized him. Using stolen IDs, he rented a room under a false name, blending once again into a world he was ready to destroy. On the early morning of January 15th, 1978, Bundy slipped into the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. He didn't break in. The doors were unlocked. What happened inside over the next 15 minutes was nothing short of a storm. Bundy moved from room to room, driven by rage and hunger. He attacked Margaret Bowman first. She was sleeping. The blow to her head came with such force that she didn't even wake. Then he turned to Lisa Levy, who suffered even worse. He choked her, assaulted her, and left wounds that investigators would later call signature cruelty. Her body bore deep marks, evidence that would link him beyond all doubt. He wasn't done. Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner were also attacked. Both survived, but with fractured bones, lasting trauma, and images they'd never forget. Then Bundy walked out of the house and vanished into the night. Only a few miles away, he attacked Cheryl Thomas, a young dancer. She lived alone. He broke into her apartment and struck fast, left her broken and barely breathing. She lived, but her injuries would end her dance career forever. 2 weeks later, he prowled around Lake City and noticed a 12-year-old girl named Kimberly Leach outside her middle school. She was innocent, polite, on her way to meet a friend. She was never seen alive again. Her disappearance triggered panic. Volunteers combed through fields, woods, rivers. Flyers blanketed the town. Hope slowly turned to dread. Her body was discovered 7 weeks later, discarded in a pig shed outside town. The scene was appalling. What had been done to her was something most officers refused to describe. That was Ted Bundy's final victim. On February 15th, 1978, Bundy was stopped by police in a stolen vehicle. He gave them a fake ID, a fake story, but his fingerprints told the truth. He was arrested. The final act had begun. His trial for the Kiyomega murders was held in Miami. A media circus from the start. Bundy, always the showman, insisted on defending himself. He turned the courtroom into theater. He cross-examined witnesses, argued with judges. He proposed to Carol Ann Boone, his former coworker, in the middle of trial. Evidence. End quote. Behind the absurdity was overwhelming evidence. The bite marks on Lisa Levy's body were matched with forensic precision to Bundy's crooked teeth. It was the kind of proof no story could spin. On July 24th, 1979, Ted Bundy was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. Bundy stalled for years, manipulating lawyers and judges. He gave TV interviews, blaming pornography and his childhood. He confessed to 30 murders, but hinted at many more. Every word, every delay was calculated, but the world was done listening. At 7:16 a.m., January 24th, 1989, the switch was flipped. Outside Florida State Prison, hundreds celebrated. Some held signs, "Burn Bundy, burn." Inside, a man who once smiled through murder he wasn't insane. He was precise, calculated, and hungry for control. Behind every disappearance was a family that never healed. Behind every courtroom smirk was a grave. Ted Bundy died in prison, but his crimes live on as a haunting reminder. The worst monsters don't hide under beds. They walk among us. Andrei Chikatilo, the butcher of Rostov. He came into the world surrounded by death. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was born in 1936 in a small Ukrainian village during the Holodomor, a state-engineered famine that claimed millions of lives. His mother told him stories of how his older brother had been kidnapped and eaten by starving neighbors. Whether it was true didn't matter. It burned into his mind. The world was a place where desperation swallowed the innocent, where survival meant silence and pain was the norm. Raised in poverty, Chikatilo grew up thin, sickly, and constantly ridiculed. His father was drafted into the Soviet army and captured by the Nazis, a dishonor that made the family a target for scorn under Stalin's rule. His mother was cold, overworked, and often violent. At school, he was mocked relentlessly. He suffered from chronic bedwetting and later crippling sexual dysfunction, a shame he buried behind a mask of quiet obedience. On the surface, he was unremarkable, a weak, bookish boy who rarely spoke above a whisper. But inside, something began to ferment. Rage, humiliation, longing for control. He couldn't relate to other children, and by the time he reached adulthood, his desires had twisted into violent obsession. Despite his social awkwardness, Chikatilo eventually married. He had children. He worked as a teacher, then a clerk. To most, he was a peculiar but harmless man. But by 1978, the mask began to slip. His first known murder was of a 9-year-old girl, Yelena Zakotnova. He approached her outside a store in Shakhty, offered to walk her home, and led her to a secluded location. There, he released everything he had kept hidden for decades. Years of frustration, rage, impotence, and hatred. She was stabbed repeatedly, then left to die. Her small body was discarded like garbage. Her murder shocked the town. An innocent man, Alexander Kravchenko, with a prior record, was arrested, tortured, and coerced into confessing. He was executed. Andrei Chikatilo walked away free. That moment was the key. He realized the system was blind. The real monster had been overlooked. And from that point forward, he embraced what he truly was. Over the next 12 years, Chikatilo embarked on one of the most gruesome and prolonged killing sprees in Soviet history. He became known as the Butcher of Rostov. His victims were mostly children and teenagers, boys and girls between the ages of 7 and 17, though a few adult women were also among the dead. His preferred hunting grounds were train stations, bus terminals, and rural roads. Anywhere the lost, lonely, or desperate passed through. He developed a method: lure the child away with promises, candy, food, a warm bed, or guidance. Once he had them isolated, usually in forests or abandoned areas, he stabbed them, sometimes 5 times, sometimes 50. He often targeted the eyes, a superstition rooted in his belief that victims' eyes captured the last thing they saw. He mutilated genitals. He bit, slashed, and dismembered. Many times, he returned to the corpses days later. The sheer level of violence wasn't random. It was ritual. A sick release of all the power he never had as a child. And in every act, he reclaimed control through someone else's agony. By the mid-1980s, bodies were turning up regularly. But the Soviet government refused to acknowledge the possibility of a serial killer. That kind of depravity, they insisted, was a Western disease. In the USSR, a state that claimed moral purity, such a criminal could not exist. So the deaths continued. Chikatilo's job as a traveling supply clerk gave him cover. He moved from city to city, always near rail lines, always alone. Local police departments didn't share information. There was no national database, no coordinated effort. Families grieved in silence, unaware their pain was part of a much larger nightmare. Meanwhile, authorities flailed in the dark. Dozens of innocent men were arrested, some beaten until they confessed. At least one committed suicide in custody. Still, the real killer roamed free. By 1984, the body count had surpassed 20. A few detectives began to suspect a pattern, but their hands were tied. Pressure from above meant they had to pretend everything was under control. Surveillance increased in certain areas, but Chikatilo had grown cunning. He changed his methods just enough to confuse profiles. Some victims were stabbed, others were strangled. Some had been violated, others were left clothed. It was chaos by design. He was arrested briefly that same year after acting suspiciously near a train station. A search revealed a knife, rope, and lubricant. He fit several eyewitness descriptions, but lacking solid forensic evidence, and with his party credentials in hand, he was released. In the years that followed, his killings grew even more brutal. In 1985, alone, he murdered 11 children. He buried some, left others sprawled in open fields. Animals scattered bones. Parents were forced to identify skeletal remains by scraps of clothing or dental records. The psychological toll on the community was enormous. Families stopped letting children walk to school. Women refused to go out alone. Everyone whispered the same name, maniac. Chikatilo began to indulge in post-mortem acts, his rituals becoming darker and more disturbing. In one case, he returned to a body days after the killing and removed organs. In another, he posed the victim's limbs. These weren't just murders. They were staged executions of innocence. It wasn't until 1990, with over 40 confirmed victims, that the Soviet government could no longer deny the truth. A task force was created under Mikhail Fetisov and Viktor Burakov, two men who had seen the carnage firsthand. Under their direction, psychological profiling was introduced, a relatively new technique in the USSR. Experts suggested the killer was a repressed, socially inept man, likely impotent with a history of childhood trauma. Chikatilo fit the profile perfectly. That fall, an undercover officer spotted Chikatilo approaching children at a Rostov train station. He was arrested again. This time, police were ready. He denied everything at first, but after days of psychological pressure and a confession from psychiatrist Dr. Bukhanovsky that he understood his urges, Chikatilo began to talk, and he didn't stop. Over the course of multiple interviews, he confessed to killing 56 people. He described their clothes, their last words, the way they screamed. He led investigators to shallow graves, reconstructed timelines, and corrected autopsy reports. He spoke in flat tones, almost academic, as though describing a biology experiment. He never cried, never apologized. The trial in 1992 was a spectacle. Journalists from around the world packed into the courtroom. Chikatilo was held in a steel cage to protect him from angry crowds. He ranted about government conspiracies, stripped naked mid-session, laughed at mothers who wept while hearing how their children died. It was horror on public display. The court heard testimonies from 23 families. Each story was more gut-wrenching than the last. Children taken from playgrounds, sisters who had just started school, boys who wanted to be engineers, girls who dreamed of being ballerinas, all silenced by a man who looked like a tired accountant. On October 14th, 1992, Andrei Chikatilo, was found guilty of 52 counts of murder and sentenced to death. He spent his final years in solitary confinement. He painted, read newspapers, wrote letters. He never showed regret. His execution was carried out in 1994. A single bullet to the back of the head. No funeral. No final words. Just a number struck off a list. But the pain he caused did not die with him. His crimes exposed everything the Soviet system had tried to hide. The failure of local law enforcement, the silence of the state, and the fragility of justice. He left behind grieving parents who buried empty coffins, a generation of children raised in fear, entire towns haunted by woods that no longer felt safe. He was not a phantom. He was not a ghost. He was a man. And that's what made him terrifying. John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown. To the outside world, John Wayne Gacy was the embodiment of American success. A hard-working contractor, a man involved in local politics, a smiling face behind clown makeup, performing as pogo at hospitals and parades. He attended church. He hosted neighborhood parties. He shook the hands of senators and smiled in photographs with the First Lady. No one knew they were standing beside a man who buried corpses under his floor. Born in 1942 in Chicago, Gacy's childhood was ruled by fear. His father was an abusive alcoholic who beat him for any sign of weakness. Gacy's health problems and his inability to meet his father's standards only fueled the beatings. He grew up feeling small, ashamed, and deeply inadequate. Feelings he never learned to escape, only bury. But as he matured, Gacy learned how to wear masks. The mask of a dutiful husband, a reliable businessman, a community servant. Underneath, something rotted, something cruel. In 1968, he was convicted for sexually assaulting a teenage boy and served time in prison. After his release, he seemed to rebuild everything: his reputation, his career, his place in the neighborhood. But behind closed doors, his urges returned with greater force. By the early 1970s, Gacy's modest home at 8213 West Somerdale Avenue had become a house of horror. He lured boys and young men with promises of easy money, a place to hang out, or a party. Many of them were runaways or from troubled families. Some worked for him. Some were just strangers passing by. He offered them drinks, jokes, clown tricks. Then he would show them his signature game, the handcuff trick. He pretended it was magic. Once they were restrained, he would whisper, "The trick is, you need the key." That's when the laughter ended. Gacy's attacks were sadistic. He subjected his victims to prolonged torture, both physical and psychological. Some were assaulted for hours before they were killed. Others were forced to watch television, eat meals, or sleep chained in place before meeting their end. And when he was finished, he dragged their bodies through the hallway and down into the crawl space beneath his house. He dug shallow graves, often returning to shift the corpses as decomposition progressed. Some victims were layered directly over others. When the crawl space filled, he disposed of additional victims by dumping them into the Des Plaines River. He didn't remember all their names. Sometimes he kept souvenirs, watches, wallets, or clothing. The smell of decay seeped through the floorboards. Neighbors complained. He blamed mold, sewage, a dead animal. No one suspected. In total, Gacy murdered at least 33 young men and boys, and he might have continued indefinitely if not for Robert Piest. In December 1978, 15-year-old Robert disappeared after meeting Gacy about a construction job. His mother waited in the car while Robert went to speak to a man with a contracting company. He never came back. The Piest family's outcry was immediate and loud. Police investigated, and when they looked into Gacy's background, they discovered his prior conviction. They placed him under surveillance. Gacy noticed. He grew erratic. He drank heavily. He taunted the officers, offering them food, inviting them inside. But they waited. They gathered evidence. Eventually, they secured a search warrant. Inside the house, they found a horrifying mosaic of death. Personal items belonging to missing boys, photographs, ID cards, bloody clothing, and beneath a hatch to the crawl space, bones. Human bones. Others had duct tape fused to their skin. Forensic investigators worked around the clock. Parents were called. Dental records were matched. Grief descended. Gacy was arrested and charged with murder. At first, he denied everything. Then, in a stunning confession, he admitted to it all. He described the handcuff trick, the burial process. He even drew a diagram of where the bodies were placed. But he showed no remorse. In court, he pleaded insanity. He claimed multiple personalities. He said the killings were done by Jack, not John. But the jury wasn't convinced. The evidence was overwhelming. The emotional weight in the courtroom crushed everyone present. Families sat beside one another, bound by a shared nightmare. In March 1980, Gacy was convicted on all charges. He was sentenced to death. While on death row, Gacy painted dozens of pieces, mostly disturbing portraits of clowns and skulls. He sold them to collectors. Some people burned them in public protests. Others bought them as grotesque trophies. He gave televised interviews, denied his guilt, blamed his victims, rewrite his history. He spent 14 years behind bars. The world moved on, but the families never forgot. On May 10th, 1994, at 12:58 a.m., John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection. His final meal was fried chicken, fried shrimp, fries, and strawberries. When asked for his last words, he muttered, "Kiss my ass." It was a fitting end to a man who never admitted what he truly was. A predator who fed on the vulnerable, who wrapped himself in smiles and paint while digging graves under his own home. But the legacy he left behind wasn't just a number. It was the broken mothers, the fatherless children, the siblings who never got to say goodbye. It was the crawl space, the smell, the funerals with closed caskets. It was the truth we can never forget. Sometimes, the most horrifying monsters wear the kindest masks, and sometimes they live right next door. The devil you don't see. 3 killers, 3 hells walked through in silence. Ted Bundy seduced his victims with charm. Andrei Chikatilo drowned them in pain. John Wayne Gacy turned trust into torture. They didn't just kill people. They destroyed futures. They shattered mothers. They erased names from birthday cakes, graduation chairs, and dinner tables. And the scariest part? No one saw them coming. Because evil doesn't always leave a trail of blood. Sometimes it holds your hand. Sometimes it fixes your roof. Sometimes it entertains your kids. These stories aren't just retellings of horror. They're warnings. Reminders that behind the kindest smile may lie the darkest soul. We speak their names not to glorify them, but to never forget what they did and what we failed to see. Because what's forgotten can return. And when it does, it might already be in your neighborhood, smiling.